Human optics, artificial irises are beautiful but really rare things that you see often in very sick eyes, eyes that have had some trauma or some horrific thing happen to them. Often these eyes have glaucoma with tube shunts and endothelial decompensation. And in the context of such a sick eye and a complex, bewildering set of circumstances, when the endothelium fails, it is often tempting for people to try to create improvement with something like a DSEK. However, in these circumstances, DMEK is still always the preferred operation. DMEK is the best form of endothelial transplantation regardless of these other circumstances like a tube shunt or like an artificial iris. And I'd like to share with you a recent patient example. This is a patient that we operated on just a couple of weeks ago in our office. We have an office-based operating suite in Birmingham, Alabama. This is not a hospital. This is not an ambulatory surgery center. This is a clinic. The patient comes in. They wear their normal clothes. They can eat breakfast. They're not in PO. The anesthesia is oral Valium and topical lidocaine, which we supplement with a little bit of a subtenon's block. We make our paracenteses, and then we use an anterior chamber maintainer connected to a 60 cc syringe filled with air, which my assistant holds, and he depresses the plunger on that syringe, which inflates the anterior chamber, and that improves my visibility and visualization of the Descemet's membrane. And you'll notice here as I'm stripping this Descemet's membrane endothelium how thick and fibrotic it is, which is typical in an eye like this that is complicated with this extensive history of multiple operations with inflammation, with glaucoma. And I'll move the anterior chamber maintainer around from one paracentesis to another to get different vantage points to allow me to strip from different perspectives. And I think this really is the key component of the operation, to remove this thick, scarred, wadded, fibrotic Descemet's membrane from the back of the cornea so you don't have these tags and rests that interfere with attachment of the new graft. You'll notice around those edges, I'm cleaning them up. These are coaxial forceps, MST forceps, that I use to grip and grab and strip these remnant areas, these shreds of Descemet's membrane that are left behind. I think it's very important to remove all of these. And frankly, this is the longest and most difficult part of the case, because if you're being meticulous, there are lots of these that you can find. So after I remove all of these, it's time then to make an iridotomy. This is an intraocular diathermy probe. It's what we use to make iridotomies. I'm not sure whether this is actually necessary in an eye that has an artificial iris, but I'll go all the way out to the periphery and I'll use it to penetrate down through this little lingering iris stump that we have, just to make sure we don't have any pupillary block once we put the graft in. So here we go. I've removed the air and now I'm about to inject the DMEK graft. You'll notice perhaps how deep the chamber is. The reason the chamber is deep is because this iris prosthetic is in the capsular bag. That's perhaps not apparent from this video, but it's like operating on an eye that has no iris. There's this extra volume. So here I am injecting the graft, and this is an unedited view of exactly how to unfold the graft. I'm using a large graft because, number one, this is a bullous keratopathy, and number two, we got a hyper deep chamber. So you want a large graft which occupies space. So I'm deepening the chamber a bit with balanced salt solution, and now I'm flipping the graft over. I'm doing that by irrigating perpendicular to the lie of the graft and depressing the main wound as I inject. And that creates this eddy current that flips the graft over. I'm checking the Motsuro sign here. The graft is right side up. So I'll do a few little shuffling bumps and I'll push one edge of the graft over. And right over there, 12 o'clock, right where I am now, that's where the patient's tube shunt is, okay? So I'm going to pull the graft up over on top of the tube shunt, and I'm going to sort of hold it there with one hand while I apply a few Dirazomer taps with the other hand. And there we go. Now the graft is more or less completely ironed out, and it's sitting on top of the tube shunt, and I can lift it up to the back surface of the cornea using an air bubble. And the key for this operation was to know basically how to handle the tube shunt and to use a large diameter graft. Because when you have a hyper deep chamber, if you've got some small little graft tumbling around in the center of the AC, it's going to be very difficult to unfold. So a large diameter graft is really what you want to use. And this is the end of the case. When the operation is concluded, by the way, the patient just sits right up, walks off the operating room table, and goes home with no supine posturing instructions, despite the fact that he has a tube shunt. Isn't that incredible? You would think that in an eye like this, complicated with glaucoma and a tube shunt and an artificial iris, surely this patient would need to lie flat after the operation to get the graft to stick. But shockingly, no, these patients do not need to lie supine either. So I think the learning point from this case, and this patient traveled from very far away to come see us because there were a lot of people, great, excellent, wonderful, talented doctors that this patient had seen that were intimidated by the idea of a DSEK under these circumstances. But actually, all of those other surgeries that the patient already had, the tube shunt, the iris prosthesis, those were probably more dangerous and difficult than the DMEK. The DMEK was the easy thing that he had. That was the simple and straightforward component of all of the surgeries that he had. That was the thing that took 1 minute to do in our office-based operating environment. But the key thing is you have to understand basically the strategy for how to approach these eyes. And that is to use a large graft when you have a hyper deep chamber and to know more or less how you're going to manage the tube shunt. So I recommend you try DMEK under these circumstances. You may be very impressed with the results.